That day in the conference room was a nightmare I'll never forget. I was sitting there, thinking it was just another quarterly review, when Madison opened her mouth and destroyed everything I'd built in 5 years. The woman I'd trusted with my biggest client contact, the colleague I'd shared apple pie with every Tuesday at Jimmy's Diner, looked directly at our managing partner and said I was too emotional to handle strategic accounts. My hands started shaking under the table. I wanted to disappear, to sink right through that ugly brown carpet and never come back. I felt rage, humiliation, betrayal, all at the same time, like someone had reached into my chest and twisted everything inside. But what came after that meeting, that was even worse. Because that's when I discovered who Madison really was, and what she'd been planning all along. From day one, I believed I had found a colleague I could truly count on. We'd grab coffee from the machine down the hall, talking about everything from quarterly reports to weekend plans. Madison seemed different from the others in our accounting firm. She actually listened when I spoke, nodded at my ideas during meetings, and never interrupted me mid-sentence like some of the guys did. I thought I'd finally found someone who understood what it meant to work hard without stepping on others. Looking back, I realize how naive that sounds, but trust used to come naturally to me. I'd built my entire career on believing that good work and genuine relationships would speak for themselves. Madison made me feel like I wasn't alone in that philosophy, like we were both swimming against the current of office politics together. Those early days felt like finding a sister in the corporate wilderness. We'd meet at Jimmy's Diner across from our building every Tuesday, splitting a piece of their famous apple pie while discussing client strategies and sharing war stories from our previous jobs. She'd compliment my approach with difficult clients, saying things like, "You've got this gift, Emma. People just open up to you." When I landed the Hartwell manufacturing account after months of cold calls and relationship building, Madison was the first person I told. She grabbed my hands right there in the break room and said she was proud of me. I remember thinking how rare it was to find someone who celebrated your wins instead of feeling threatened by them. We started covering for each other during lunch hours, sharing workload when deadlines got tight, and I genuinely believed we were building something real. A partnership based on mutual respect and professional integrity. The trust between us grew so naturally that I never questioned her motives when she started asking more detailed questions about my client relationships. She'd lean against my cubicle wall every morning, coffee in hand, asking how I managed to keep clients so engaged, what my secret was for making them feel heard. I took it as genuine curiosity, maybe even admiration. When she mentioned struggling with her own client retention, I shared everything I knew, the importance of remembering personal details, following up on their family situations, sending handwritten thank you notes after big projects. I even gave her copies of the templates I developed over years of trial and error. Madison would nod thoughtfully, taking notes in her little leather notebook, and I felt good knowing I was helping someone I cared about succeed. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a tiny voice whispered warnings I chose to ignore. The shift was so subtle I almost missed it entirely. Madison started sitting closer to the partners during our monthly all-hands meetings, asking questions that positioned her as someone thinking strategically about the firm's future. She'd throw around phrases like scalable solutions and optimized client experience, language that sounded impressive but said very little. Meanwhile, I noticed she stopped asking for my advice as often, stopped lingering by my desk for our morning chats. When I tried to continue our usual conversations about client strategies, she'd give me these polite but distant smiles and say she was swamped. I told myself she was just busy, that success was demanding more of her time. I wanted to believe that our friendship was strong enough to weather the natural ebb and flow of workplace dynamics. After all, I'd seen how this job could consume people, how it could change them without them even realizing it. One afternoon in late September, Madison approached me with what she called just a tiny favor. She needed a reference contact for a potential new client she was pitching, someone who could vouch for our firm's ability to handle complex manufacturing accounts. The client was apparently asking for references from similar businesses, and she wondered if I might be willing to share Harold Brennan's contact information. Harold was my longest-standing client, a gruff but fair man who'd been with me for almost 8 years. Ever since I'd helped his company navigate a brutal IRS audit, I'd watched his kids graduate college, attended his wife's funeral, and celebrated when his business finally turned the corner after years of struggle. When Madison asked for his number, every instinct should have told me to hesitate, to ask more questions, to protect what I'd spent years building. Instead, I wrote Harold's direct line on a sticky note and handed it over with a smile. Madison's reaction was perfect, grateful, but not overly enthusiastic, professional but warm. She tucked the number into her notebook and thanked me for being such a team player. "This is exactly why I respect you so much, Emma," she said. "You're always thinking about what's best for the firm, not just yourself." Those words made me feel proud, validated in my decision to share something so valuable. I walked back to my desk that day feeling like I'd done the right thing, like I'd strengthened both our friendship and our company's prospects. That evening, I even mentioned it to my husband over dinner, telling him how good it felt to help a colleague succeed. He raised an eyebrow and asked if I was sure about giving away such an important contact, but I laughed off his concern. I told him that trust was a two-way street, and that Madison would do the same for me without hesitation. The silence that followed was deafening in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Within a week, Madison stopped joining me for our Tuesday dinners at Jimmy's, claiming she had too many evening calls with prospects. Our morning coffee chats became brief nods in the hallway. When I tried to ask how the Harold reference had worked out, she'd give me vague answers about "still waiting to hear back" or "these things take time." But I started noticing her in deeper conversations with our managing partner, huddled over spreadsheets and whispering about client acquisition strategies. The leather notebook I'd seen her use to jot down my advice was now filled with what looked like detailed business plans and client profiles. I felt a growing unease, like watching storm clouds gather on what had been a clear day. Something was shifting beneath the surface of our professional relationship, and I was the only one who didn't seem to know what it was. Everything collapsed during what I thought would be just another routine quarterly review meeting. We were gathered in the conference room with its outdated brown carpet and flickering fluorescent lights, the same room where I presented countless successful project updates over the years. I had my usual spot near the window, my portfolio of client success stories neatly organized in the blue binder I'd used since my first year at the firm. Madison sat across from me, looking polished and prepared in a way that should have been my first warning sign. She had new clothes, I noticed, a sharp blazer that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and her hair was styled differently, more executive-like. Our managing partner, Richard Conway, was running through the quarterly numbers when Madison raised her hand with what seemed like a thoughtful question about client retention strategies. What came out of her mouth next cut through me like a blade I never saw coming. "I've been thinking about our approach to client relationships," she said, her voice steady and measured, "and I wonder if we might be too dependent on emotional connections rather than demonstrable value delivery." The room went quiet in that particular way that happens when someone says something that sounds important but feels dangerous. She continued, looking directly at Richard while gesturing vaguely in my direction. "Don't get me wrong, relationship building is valuable, but we need people who can deliver concrete results without relying so heavily on personal charm and feelings." The word feelings came out of her mouth like it tasted bitter, like it was something unprofessional that needed to be cleaned up. I felt every pair of eyes in that room turn toward me, and I knew without anyone saying my name that I was the target of her carefully crafted criticism. Richard's reaction told me everything I needed to know about how long this conversation had been brewing behind closed doors. He didn't look surprised by Madison's comment. Instead, he nodded slowly, like someone considering a point they'd already heard before. His eyes met mine for just a second before he looked away, and in that brief glance I saw something that made my stomach drop. It was the look you give someone when you're trying to figure out how to let them down easy, when you've already made up your mind but haven't figured out how to break the news. "That's an interesting perspective, Madison," he said, making notes on his legal pad. Sustainable growth does require measurable outcomes. The way he said it made it sound like he was agreeing with something profound rather than listening to someone systematically undermine a colleague who had helped build half the client base sitting in our portfolio. I wanted to defend myself, to remind everyone in that room that Harold Brennan and 3 other major clients had specifically requested to work only with me, that my emotional approach had saved the Hartwell account when they were ready to walk away last spring. I wanted to point out that the quarterly numbers Madison was using to make her case included revenue from relationships I had nurtured for years, long before she even knew our office existed. That something about the way the conversation was flowing, the way Richard was nodding and taking notes, told me that speaking up would only make me look defensive and prove her point about being too emotional. So I sat there, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, feeling my face burn with frustration and humiliation, while she continued to paint me as someone who was nice but not strategic, caring but not effective. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but I barely heard any of it. My mind was racing, trying to piece together how we had gotten to this point. How the woman who used to split apple pie with me was now sitting across a conference table, dismantling my professional reputation with surgical precision. When Richard finally dismissed us, I gathered my things slowly, hoping someone might approach me to discuss Madison's comments or at least acknowledge that they seemed out of left field. Instead, I watched Madison linger near Richard's chair, pulling out her leather notebook to show him something that made him raise his eyebrows with interest. They were having the kind of hushed, important conversation that happens after meetings when the real decisions get made. And I knew with sinking certainty that I wasn't going to be part of whatever they were planning. Walking back to my desk felt like the longest journey of my professional life. I passed colleagues who had been in that meeting, and their polite smiles felt different now, like they were looking at me through the lens of Madison's criticism. Was I really too emotional? Had I been fooling myself about my value to the firm? These questions swirled in my head as I sat down at my computer and stared at my email inbox, seeing client names that suddenly felt less like relationships and more like evidence of my apparent professional weakness. I thought about calling Harold to get his perspective, but the idea of explaining what had just happened made me feel sick to my stomach. How do you tell someone who has trusted you for 8 years that your own colleagues think your approach to business is fundamentally flawed? That afternoon, I discovered the real reason behind Madison's performance in the meeting. While updating client files in our CRM system, I noticed that Harold Brennan's account had been flagged for relationship manager transition, and Madison's name appeared in the notes as his new primary contact. The entry was dated 3 days earlier, which meant this decision had been made before her speech about emotional dependence and measurable outcomes. She hadn't been making a general observation about our firm's strategy. She had been building a public case for why she was the right person to handle my most important client. I stared at that computer screen until the words blurred together, finally understanding that everything from the friendly dinners to the shared confidences to the request for Harold's contact information had been part of a calculated plan to position herself as my replacement. The narrative about who I was professionally began shifting in ways so subtle that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. What had once been described as my natural ability to connect with clients slowly morphed into whispers about being too relationship-focused and emotionally invested in outcomes. I started noticing how conversations would pause when I entered the break room, how colleagues would exchange glances when I shared updates about client interactions during team meetings. Madison had planted a seed during that quarterly review, and now it was growing in the minds of everyone around me. The woman who had built her reputation on solid numbers and long-term client retention was suddenly being painted as someone who relied too heavily on feelings and not enough on hard business strategy. It was like watching someone rewrite history while you stood there helpless to correct the record. The change became most obvious in how projects were distributed. Assignments that used to come directly to my desk were now being shared with Madison. But the division of labor told a story that anyone with eyes could see. She would take the high-visibility pieces, the client presentations, the strategy meetings, the parts that put her in front of Richard and the other partners. I got stuck with the behind-the-scenes work, the detailed analysis and problem-solving that kept accounts running smoothly, but didn't come with recognition or credit. When I'd mention this imbalance during our weekly team check-ins, Richard would nod thoughtfully and say something about playing to our strengths and optimizing team efficiency. But what he really meant was that Madison looked the part of a rising star while I was being repositioned as reliable support staff, valuable but not leadership material. The most devastating blow came during a conference call with HR that I thought was going to be routine performance feedback. I was sitting in the small glass-walled office they used for private conversations, looking out at the familiar buzz of the main floor, while Janet Morrison from Human Resources pulled up my file on her laptop. Madison was there too, which struck me as odd since these reviews were typically one-on-one affairs. But Janet explained that they were trying a new collaborative feedback approach to help team members grow together. What followed was 20 minutes of the most professionally brutal character assassination I'd ever experienced, delivered in the calm, measured tones of corporate speak that made every criticism sound like helpful guidance, rather than a systematic dismantling of my professional identity. Madison spoke about me like I was a case study in workplace psychology rather than a colleague she'd worked alongside for months. "I think Emma has this beautiful way of caring about people," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "But sometimes I worry that she struggles to separate personal feelings from business decisions." She went on to describe instances where I'd supposedly let emotional attachments cloud my judgment, like the time I'd advocated for extending a deadline when a client's family business was going through a rough patch, or when I'd spent extra time helping a struggling account get their books in order, rather than recommending they find a different firm. Each example was twisted just enough to make my empathy and dedication sound like professional weaknesses, like character flaws that needed to be managed rather than strengths that had built lasting client relationships. Janet nodded along, typing notes that I knew would become part of my permanent file, creating an official record of my alleged emotional instability and poor business judgment. "It's great that you care so much about your clients," she said in that patronizing tone HR people use when they're about to deliver bad news. "But we need to make sure that caring doesn't compromise your ability to make objective decisions in the firm's best interest." The word objective hung in the air like an accusation, as if everything I'd accomplished over the years had been the result of sentiment rather than skill. I wanted to ask them to look at my retention rates, to review the testimonial letters clients had written, to consider the actual results, rather than this manufactured narrative about emotional decision-making. But sitting in that room, outnumbered and clearly outmaneuvered, I realized that facts weren't going to matter in this conversation. The meeting ended with what they called an action plan for my professional development. I would be working more closely with Madison on client management strategies, learning to approach relationships with what Janet called appropriate professional boundaries. They scheduled monthly check-ins to monitor my progress in becoming more analytically focused and less personally invested in client outcomes. As I walked back to my desk with a folder full of self-improvement resources and behavioral modification guidelines, I felt like I was carrying my own professional death certificate. Madison caught up with me in the hallway, putting her hand on my shoulder with that same fake concern she'd perfected. "I hope you know this comes from a place of wanting to help," she said. "We all have areas where we can grow." The word "we" was particularly galling, considering she was the one doing the growing while I was being systematically diminished. That night, I sat in my car in the office parking lot for almost an hour after everyone else had gone home, staring at the building where I'd spent 5 years building what I thought was a solid reputation. The fluorescent lights were still on in Richard's office, and I could see him through the window, probably reviewing the notes from my HR meeting and planning how to manage what they now saw as the Emma situation. I thought about all the late nights I'd spent in that building, all the weekends I'd worked to ensure client satisfaction, all the relationships I'd built that had brought real value to the firm. Now it felt like all of that was being erased by someone who'd learned to speak the language of corporate advancement better than I'd ever bothered to learn. I started the engine and drove home, knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same careful erosion of everything I'd worked to build, one collaborative feedback session at a time. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices or slamming doors that would have at least given me something concrete to point to as evidence of mistreatment. Instead, what happened to me was far more insidious. The slow, methodical erasure of my professional identity through 1,000 small cuts that left no visible wounds. I became invisible in plain sight, sitting in the same cubicle I'd occupied for years while watching my relevance evaporate like morning mist. The worst part wasn't even losing Harold's account or seeing Madison take credit for strategies I developed. The worst part was how normal it all looked from the outside. How easily my colleagues adapted to a version of reality where I had simply become less important without anyone having to acknowledge what was really happening. The new narrative about my professional capabilities spread through the office like a virus, infecting every interaction and recoloring every memory of my past successes. Colleagues who used to seek out my input on difficult clients began prefacing their questions with apologetic phrases like, "I know you're busy with other things," or "This might not be your area anymore." Daniel Rodriguez, who had worked 2 cubicles away from me for 3 years, actually apologized for bothering me when he asked about a client communication issue, the same type of problem I'd been helping him solve since his first week at the firm. When I reminded him that client relations was literally my specialty, he looked uncomfortable and mumbled something about not wanting to step on anyone's toes. I realized that Madison hadn't just repositioned herself as the expert. She'd convinced everyone that seeking my advice was somehow inappropriate or outdated. The exclusion from decision-making meetings was particularly cruel, because it happened gradually enough that I could convince myself it was coincidental. First, I stopped receiving calendar invites to strategic planning sessions, which Richard explained as an effort to streamline the process and avoid overwhelming people with meetings outside their core responsibilities. Then I was dropped from the client onboarding calls that I'd been leading for 2 years, because Madison suggested it would be more efficient to have a single point person handle initial client interactions. Each removal was presented as a logical business decision, a way to optimize workflow and reduce redundancy. But the cumulative effect was that I became a spectator to conversations that directly impacted my work, finding out about major decisions through secondhand information and office gossip. The cruelest moment came during what should have been a celebration. The firm was hosting a client appreciation event at the Riverside Country Club, one of those stuffy affairs where everyone pretended to enjoy warm white wine and talked about quarterly projections over rubber chicken dinners. I'd been to dozens of these events over the years, usually playing a central role in greeting longtime clients and facilitating introductions between new prospects and our senior partners. This time, I received my invitation 3 days before the event, clearly an afterthought, and when I arrived, I discovered my name wasn't on any of the planning committees or hosting responsibilities. Madison was everywhere, gliding between tables in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary, introducing herself to clients I've been working with for years as their new relationship manager. The moment that broke something inside me happened near the dessert table, where I was standing alone, watching Harold Brennan laugh at something Madison was saying, while she gestured toward a PowerPoint presentation on her tablet. Harold had been my client for 8 years, had trusted me with his company's financial future, through good times and bad, and now he was nodding thoughtfully as Madison explained some new strategic approach that sounded suspiciously like the retention plan I developed for his account last spring. When she noticed me watching, Madison actually waved me over with a smile that looked warm, but felt like ice. "Emma, come meet Harold's new CFO," she said, as if Harold and I were strangers who needed an introduction. Harold looked confused for a moment, then gave me the kind of polite but distant smile you'd give to someone you vaguely recognized but couldn't quite place. I excused myself and spent the rest of the evening in the country club's ladies' room, staring at my reflection in the ornate mirror and trying to understand how I'd become so forgettable so quickly. When I finally returned to the main room, most of the clients had left, and the remaining staff were cleaning up tables and collecting name tags. Madison found me near the coat check and made a show of thanking me for coming, speaking to me like I was a vendor who'd provided a service rather than a colleague who'd helped build half the relationships in that room. "It's so important to have everyone here to support our clients," she said, her voice loud enough for nearby partners to hear. The word support hung in the air like a judgment, defining my new role as background assistance rather than primary contributor. Driving home that night through the quiet suburban streets, I realized that I'd been systematically written out of my own professional story. The clients I'd cultivated, the strategies I'd developed, the relationships I'd nurtured, all of it was being reattributed to someone who'd learned to package my work in more appealing corporate language. I wasn't being fired or demoted in any official sense, but I was being made redundant in the most painful way possible, by being replaced while still physically present, like a ghost haunting my own career. The next morning, I would wake up and go to the same office, sit at the same desk, and continue doing work that somehow mattered less and less each day, while everyone around me acted like this gradual erasure was the natural order of things. But that night, sitting in my driveway with the engine off and the house dark in front of me, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I wasn't going to disappear quietly, and I wasn't going to let Madison's version of events become the only story anyone remembered. I had spent too many years building something real to let it be dismantled by someone who'd learned to speak fluent corporate manipulation. The question wasn't whether I had been betrayed. That much was clear. The question was what I was going to do about it. And for the first time in months, I felt something other than resignation stirring in my chest. They never told me directly that I was being pushed out, but the signs were impossible to ignore once I knew how to read them. My workload shifted from challenging client management to administrative tasks that felt suspiciously like busy work designed to keep me occupied while more important decisions were made around me. I found myself updating database entries that had been perfectly fine for months, reorganizing filing systems that didn't need reorganizing, and conducting comprehensive reviews of processes that everyone knew were working just fine. It was corporate purgatory. Not quite fired, but definitely not valued, existing in a professional limbo where my salary continued, but my purpose had evaporated. Richard started avoiding direct eye contact during our brief interactions, speaking to me in the overly polite tone people use when they're trying to manage someone they'd rather not deal with at all. The performance improvement plan they presented to me 3 weeks later was a masterpiece of bureaucratic doublespeak. 20 pages of development goals and measurable outcomes that basically amounted to a formal acknowledgement that I was being managed out of my position. The document outlined how I would work more closely with Madison to enhance my strategic thinking capabilities and develop more objective decision-making frameworks. Every single action item was designed to position her as the mentor and me as the struggling student who needed remedial training and skills I'd been successfully using for years. When Janet Morrison from HR walked me through the plan during what she called a collaborative goal-setting session, I realized I was looking at my professional death warrant written in the language of career development. The timeline was particularly cruel in its precision: 6 months to demonstrate significant improvement in areas that had never been problems before Madison's campaign, to redefine my strengths as weaknesses. I would be evaluated monthly on my progress toward becoming more analytically focused and less emotionally driven in my client interactions. The metrics they established were impossible to meet because they were based on a fundamental mischaracterization of what good client service actually looked like. How do you measure the value of remembering a client's daughter's wedding or following up on their concerns about industry changes? How do you quantify the trust that comes from years of consistent, caring professional relationships? The plan ignored everything that had made me successful and focused exclusively on areas where Madison naturally excelled. Reading through that document felt like watching someone dissect my professional DNA and declare most of it defective. They wanted me to become more like Madison, more polished, more strategic in my language, more focused on metrics that looked good in quarterly reports, rather than relationships that sustained long-term business success. But the cruelest part wasn't the criticism of who I was. It was the pretense that this was all being done to help me grow. Janet kept using phrases like, exciting opportunity for development, and chance to expand your skill set, as if being systematically stripped of my responsibilities was some kind of gift. I signed the document, because refusing would have meant immediate termination. But putting my name on those pages felt like agreeing to my own professional execution. The isolation that followed was almost complete. Madison took over the client relationships I'd spent years building, armed with all the insights and strategies I'd shared during our supposed friendship, while I was relegated to supporting roles that kept me busy but invisible. My colleagues adapted to this new reality with the kind of willful blindness that corporate environments breed, treating my diminished status as if it were a natural evolution rather than a calculated demolition. When I tried to contribute during team meetings, my suggestions were acknowledged with polite nods and then quietly ignored, as if I were a well-meaning but out-of-touch relative offering outdated advice at a family gathering. The final insult came during my last scheduled one-on-one with Richard, 6 months after the improvement plan had been implemented. I had prepared extensively for this meeting, documenting every goal I'd achieved and every metric I'd improved, hoping to demonstrate that their assessment of my capabilities had been unfair. But Richard barely glanced at my materials before delivering what he'd probably been planning to say regardless of my performance. "Emma, you're a valued team member," he began, using the past tense in a way that made my stomach clench. "But I think it's time we had an honest conversation about whether this role is still the right fit for your strengths." The word fit did a lot of work in that sentence, suggesting that the problem wasn't my performance, but some fundamental mismatch between who I was and what the firm needed. He offered me a choice that wasn't really a choice at all, except a lateral transition to a role with significantly reduced responsibilities and client contact, or consider exploring opportunities that might be better aligned with my communication style. The lateral position he described sounded like corporate exile, handling internal processes and supporting other people's client work, while being gradually forgotten by everyone who mattered. The alternative was resignation disguised as mutual agreement, allowing both of us to pretend that my departure was voluntary, rather than the culmination of months of systematic undermining. I told him I needed time to think about it, but we both knew I was really just deciding how I wanted to end a career that had already been effectively terminated. Walking out of that meeting, I felt like I was carrying the weight of not just my own professional failure, but the failure of a system that rewarded manipulation over competence, style over substance. I had spent 5 years building something I was proud of, only to watch it be dismantled by someone who'd learned to game the corporate advancement system better than I ever could. But as I packed up my personal items that evening, preparing for what I knew would be my last few weeks in that office, I realized that Madison's victory might not be as complete as she thought. She had won the battle for my position and my clients, but she had also created an enemy who finally understood the rules of the game she'd been playing all along. The hardest part about leaving wasn't cleaning out my desk or turning in my company laptop. It was dealing with the deafening silence that followed my departure from a place where I'd spent 5 years of my life. No farewell lunch, no goodbye card passed around the office, no acknowledgement that someone who had contributed significantly to the firm's success was walking away. Instead, there was just a brief email from HR announcing my transition to new opportunities and thanking me for my service in language so generic it could have been copied and pasted from a template. I became a non-person overnight, erased from the company directory and forgotten by colleagues who had worked alongside me for years, as if I'd never existed at all. The professional isolation was devastating, but the personal betrayal cut even deeper. Harold Brennan, the client I'd shepherded through 8 years of business challenges, never reached out to ask why I was no longer handling his account. I'd attended his daughter's graduation party, sent flowers when his wife died, and celebrated with him when his company finally turned profitable after years of struggle. But when Madison took over his account, he He apparently accepted the transition without question, either unaware of the circumstances or unbothered by the loss of our long-standing relationship. The silence from someone I'd considered both a client and a friend made me question whether any of those personal connections had been as meaningful as I'd believed. My mornings became exercises in existential confusion, waking up at the same time I'd gotten up for work, but having nowhere to go and nothing urgent to accomplish. I'd find myself getting dressed in business attire out of habit, making coffee and checking emails that no longer mattered, sitting at my kitchen table and staring out the window at a world that had moved on without me. The routine of professional life had been such a fundamental part of my identity that losing it left me feeling untethered, like an astronaut whose lifeline to the space station had been cut. My husband would find me there some mornings, still in my robe at 10 o'clock, having lost track of time while contemplating how quickly everything I'd built could disappear. The worst moments came when I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to call clients about issues that were no longer my responsibility, or when I'd drive past the office building and see the lights on in conference rooms, where decisions were being made without me. I had to resist the urge to stop by, to check in with former colleagues, to maintain some connection to the professional world that had defined me for so long. But I knew that showing up would only confirm what everyone probably already believed, that I was having trouble accepting my new reality, that I was clinging to a role that had outgrown me. The few people who did reach out made the silence from everyone else even more painful by contrast. Kelly Martinez, a junior associate who'd started at the firm 6 months before I left, sent me a text message that I must have read 50 times. "You were the only person who really listened to me when I was struggling. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Her words were a lifeline during those early weeks of unemployment, a reminder that my approach to work had mattered to someone, even if the people in charge had decided it was outdated. But one supportive message couldn't erase the sting of being forgotten by everyone else, couldn't fill the void left by Harold's silence or my former colleagues' complete lack of interest in staying in touch. I started having dreams about the office, vivid nightmares where I'd show up for work only to find my desk had been removed, or where I'd be standing in meetings trying to speak, but no sound would come out of my mouth. In one recurring dream, I was back at Jimmy's diner with Madison, splitting apple pie and talking about client strategies, but when I looked down at my plate, the pie had turned to ashes. I'd wake up from these dreams feeling exhausted, like I'd been fighting battles all night that I could never win. Sleep became another place where I was haunted by the professional life that had been taken from me. The emotional toll was compounded by the practical realities of job searching in a field where everyone knew everyone, where reputations preceded resumes, and where Madison's version of events had likely spread through industry networks faster than I could control. I found myself having to explain not just why I'd left my previous position, but why I'd been managed out of it, trying to spin a story of professional growth and new challenges, and what had really happened was systematic sabotage. Each interview became an exercise in damage control, an attempt to convince strangers that I was competent and stable despite evidence suggesting I'd been unable to succeed in my most recent role. But slowly, in the quiet hours of those empty days, something began to shift inside me. The initial shock and grief started giving way to a clearer understanding of what had actually happened, and more importantly, what I'd learned from surviving it. I began to see Madison's betrayal not as evidence of my own inadequacy, but as proof that I'd been naive about the realities of workplace politics. I'd been playing checkers while she was playing chess, focused on doing good work while she was focused on positioning herself for advancement. The lesson was painful but valuable. Competence alone wasn't enough in environments where perception mattered more than performance, where the ability to manage up was more important than the ability to serve clients well. The education I received from Madison's betrayal was expensive, paid for with 5 years of career building and months of professional humiliation, but it taught me lessons about workplace dynamics that no business school could have provided. I learned that trust in corporate environments needs to be earned through consistent actions over time, not granted freely based on shared lunches and friendly conversations. I discovered that information is currency, and sharing too much too quickly can arm someone with everything they need to replace you. Most importantly, I understood that protecting your own interests isn't selfish. It's survival. And anyone who tells you otherwise might be positioning themselves to take advantage of your generosity. The first and most crucial change I made was developing what I call strategic boundaries around my professional relationships and valuable assets. When I finally landed a new position at a mid-sized consulting firm 6 months later, I made it clear from day one that while I was happy to collaborate and mentor junior colleagues, certain information would remain proprietary until trust was established through demonstrated loyalty over time. Client contact information, successful strategies I developed, and insights about account management became closely guarded resources that I shared selectively and only after careful consideration of the potential risks. This wasn't about being secretive or paranoid. It was about learning to value my own contributions, enough to protect them from people who might use them against me. I also developed a much sharper eye for the warning signs I'd missed with Madison, the subtle indicators that someone might be more interested in advancement than partnership. People who ask too many detailed questions about your methods while sharing little about their own. Colleagues who position themselves strategically in meetings while staying silent during difficult conversations. Team members who seemed more concerned with visibility than results. These became red flags that triggered my professional defense mechanisms. I learned to listen not just to what people said, but to what they didn't say, to watch their actions when they thought no one was paying attention, to notice who they chose to align themselves with during office politics. The hardest lesson was accepting that not every colleague who seemed friendly actually wished me well, and that workplace relationships required the same kind of careful evaluation I'd always applied to business partnerships. I stopped assuming that shared experiences and mutual support automatically created genuine loyalty, instead watching for consistent patterns of behavior that demonstrated real commitment to mutual success. This wasn't about becoming cynical or distrustful, but about developing realistic expectations for professional relationships and protecting myself from people who might see my openness as an opportunity to exploit. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to recognize and value my own worth in ways that made me less vulnerable to manipulation. Madison had been able to undermine me partly because I'd internalized some doubt about whether my relationship-focused approach was really as valuable as more traditionally strategic methods. But my new role quickly proved that clients still valued authentic connection and personalized service, that the skills Madison had labeled as emotional weaknesses were actually market differentiators that set me apart from competitors who treated business relationships like impersonal transactions. Understanding my own value gave me the confidence to defend my methods and contributions, instead of apologizing for them or trying to change them to fit someone else's definition of professionalism. I also made peace with the fact that I couldn't control how Madison's story ended, but I could control how mine continued, obsessing over whether she eventually faced consequences for her behavior, whether Harold ever realized what he'd lost, or whether Richard understood the mistake he'd made in choosing her over me would only keep me trapped in resentment and regret. The real victory wasn't in seeing her fail, but in rebuilding my own career with better boundaries, clear self-awareness, and stronger defenses against future betrayals. She had taught me to be more strategic without becoming manipulative, more protective without becoming paranoid. The experience fundamentally changed how I approached trust in professional settings, but it didn't make me bitter or closed off to genuine collaboration. Instead, it made me more discerning about who earned access to my ideas, my contacts, and my vulnerability. I learned to distinguish between colleagues who wanted to learn from my success and those who wanted to replace me with it, between people who celebrated my achievements and those who studied them for weaknesses they could exploit. This wisdom came at a high price, but it was knowledge that would protect me for the rest of my career. Looking back now, 3 years later, I can honestly say that Madison did me a favor, though not the kind she intended. She forced me to develop professional instincts I'd never needed before, to value myself in ways I'd never bothered to learn, and to build defenses I'd never realized were necessary. The naive woman who had trustingly handed over Harold Brennan's contact information no longer existed, replaced by someone wiser, more strategic, and ultimately more successful because she understood the difference between being generous and being foolish. I wouldn't wish that education on anyone, but I'm grateful for the strength and clarity it gave me, even if the teacher was someone who tried to destroy me in the process. If this story opened your eyes to something you needed to see, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I've got more hard-earned wisdom about surviving workplace betrayal, office politics, and the people who'll use your trust against you. Because the best defense against being blindsided is knowing exactly what to watch for. And I'm here to make sure you never have to learn these lessons the way I did.